Beekeeping has changed a lot over the last 200 years. In fact, we've been experiencing a dramatic paradigm shift that's been incrementing so slowly that we've barely noticed its slow, steady charge through the beekeeping world. There are two developments that changed everything, and this may be the most important video you ever watch to learn about why beekeeping is in the state that it is in. And we'll get to that coming right up.
Hi, I'm Scott McPherson, and this is Beekeeping from Scratch, where it's about the bees.
Hey beekeepers, if we haven't met yet, my name is Scott McPherson, and this is my channel, Beekeeping from Scratch, where we document our journey keeping bees from scratch and growing our operation to be more than just a successful hobby. And I want to welcome you to the first installment of an ongoing series called Nothing But Bees, where we discuss bees, beekeeping, and other topics that directly affect and impact our bees. Now, I know that this channel is already a beekeeping channel, but this show is a discussion of bees and beekeeping topics rather than being informational, documenting, or journaling what's going on in my beehives. All right, now let's get this started right now. So, does anyone care to fancy a guess at what started the revolution of beekeeping that's still going on today? Very specifically, the Reverend Langstroth invented and patented the Langstroth hive. His invention and furious marketing and lobbying of government officials made huge impacts to the beekeeping world, changes that have rippled through time and continue to affect us today. Now, the purpose of this video isn't to provide a history lesson in beekeeping, but it's important to have a cursory knowledge of that history to why a shift in the beekeeping paradigm has taken place. So with that, bear with me for just a few minutes while we take a short stroll through history. The earliest beekeeping was little more than hunting for wild colonies and destroying the nest to collect the honey. And in some cultures, pollen and brood were also considered part of the delicacy. Today, there are some cultures in the world that do eat bees and brood and consider it a protein-rich part of their diet. However, in most of the Western world, we don't really eat bees and brood and stick mostly to eating honey, and sometimes pollen. Then sometime in the very distant past, after people developed tools, they realized that they could cut the tree above and below the nest and bring the colony home with them. However, logs are really heavy and not easily moved. Once the colony died, they probably tore apart the colony and harvested all of the nest products, and then burned the log for fuel. At least 5,000 years ago, people discovered that if you could catch a swarm and put them into a container that they liked, that you could bring those bees home back with you and keep a bunch of those hives together. These were our first apiaries. These containers were carefully carved out logs with hinge doors or plugs to get to key areas of the colony, so you could cut out some honey from time to time. Some were even finally made to stack, just like a stack of logs, with the entrance in one side and a plug in the other so that the beekeepers could get to the back of the hive and to the honey. But these designs caused the bees to swarm really frequently because the brood nest would often get honey-bound and there wasn't a whole lot that the beekeeper could do about it. But that was okay because the bees did swarm, and they swarmed often, so the beekeeper could continue to keep their stack of beehives filled with bees. The skep was also developed about 2,400 years ago as a lighter alternative to pots and logs. And the skep might not be stackable, but it was made from easily obtained materials that were almost infinitely available, such as rush, grasses, and brambles. It was also expandable in a limited fashion if the beekeeper found the bees needed just a little bit more room, and that was called an eek. Aristotle describes keeping bees in basket top bar hives in his book Historia Animalium about 3,000 years ago. These were little more than baskets that had sticks placed on top once the bees were installed. It allowed beekeepers to remove combs of honey and perhaps even perform splits. But by their very nature, the combs were not very interchangeable between existing colonies. And additionally, except for maybe the odd comb at the edges of the colony, it was impossible, or at best difficult, to harvest honey without destroying some brood comb. In China, beekeepers are documented as keeping bees in wooden boxes as early as 500 BCE by the philosopher Fan Li. I don't really know a whole lot about these wooden boxes because I don't have access to that reference material. Beekeeping in nearly all these methods of keeping bees was an annual or biennial practice, letting the bees fill up their home with honey, either swarming naturally or being killed or driven out in order to collect the products of the beehive. New colonies were established from these swarms or from wild collected swarms. Throughout history, there have been incremental innovations and improvements in beekeeping that have made beekeeping easier for the beekeeper. Innovation continues today and at a much faster pace. However, there are two major developments that happened in the second half of the 19th century that began the slow march of change to the very foundation of beekeeping philosophy and practice. Throughout history, up to and through the Dark and Middle Ages, beekeeping culture was centered around temples, churches, abbeys, and monasteries, because beeswax was prized for making candles. In the United States, beekeeping might not have been as centralized as it was in Europe, and indeed one of the principal ways that a family had candles and sweets was because they kept bees or there was a town or village beekeeper in the neighborhood. Beeswax was a fundamental resource. Therefore, finding ways to preserve intact combs didn't come into fashion until about the 1800s. Once other sources for lighting and lubrication became available, such as whale oil, coal gas, and paraffin wax, the need to harvest beeswax began to diminish, and the movable frame hives began to come into fashion. However, there was a point in history about 168 years ago where the accumulation of bee knowledge led to the development of the Langstroth hive and the Hoffman frame. Not only were the bees and combs kept in frames, but now the hives were standardized, stackable, and gave the beekeeper the ability to make room above the bees to store honey, or make room down below the brood nest so that the bees could increase the size of the brood nest. Due to Langstroth's ingenuity and his mad desire to market his hive and lobby government officials to make Langstroth the only legal hive to use in some states, put the Langstroth hive into the forefront of American beekeeping. The Langstroth hive was, and still is, essentially the standard that the beekeeping industry settled on. In fact, in some states, counties, and municipalities, the Langstroth is still listed specifically as the only legal hive. The laws still say that bees must be kept in Langstroth hives. The rest of the world followed with their own designs, but nearly all movable frame colonies today are direct descendants of the Langstroth hive. This standardization has provided the ability to create an infrastructure around the beekeeping industry and is the first fundamental change in beekeeping. Even today, we continue to learn new tricks and ways that have been enabled directly because of the Langstroth hive. In 1878, Ames root, better known as AI root, was the first to experiment in transporting bees without comb and their heavy hives. The first year he experimented by putting a call out to southern beekeepers and offered $1 per pound of bees successfully shipped to Medina, Ohio. It was so successful that he doubled the price next year to $2 a pound. The practice of buying and starting bees from packages was well underway, and ever since then, package bees have become the number one way to get started in beekeeping and for established operations to replenish their livestock. This practice represents the second event that changed fundamental beekeeping. The sourcing of huge quantities of bees and queens from the subtropics to the near exclusion of all other means of getting bees, such as catching swarms and dividing strong colonies. With the advent of the Langstroth hive, it became clear that we could produce huge crops of honey. But in order to do that, beekeepers needed to maintain strong colonies with huge populations of bees. When a colony swarms, it leaves behind a weakened population of bees. And big colonies cast big swarms or multiple swarms, leaving behind a virgin queen with barely enough bees to build back up and prepare to winter, let alone produce a nice crop for the beekeeper. In the past, this was dealt with by either breaking down the beehive or leaving the colony alone and letting it build back up and prepare for next season. With the ability to get into and manage the brood nest, the beekeeper has the ability to manage how the bees behave somewhat. And when a colony shows signs of preparing to swarm, a beekeeper can take one or several measures to prevent or at least dissuade the bees from swarming. With all other variables such as weather or bloom being disregarded, successfully preventing swarms is the best way for a beekeeper to secure a big crop of honey. When colonies swarm, the first swarm cast is usually headed up by the old queen, and a virgin queen is left behind with the old colony, and that means the original colony is automatically refreshed with a new queen. The swarm, more often than not, once it gets established, replaces the queen through supersedure, and therefore the swarm gets its queen refreshed as well. Therefore, one of the consequences of swarm prevention is that we no longer have colonies that are being refreshed naturally on an annual or a biannual basis. As a result, and because of the practice of marking queens, beekeepers started to record that their queens were living 2, 3, 4, 5, and sometimes even more years. However, in the mean, queens are usually replaced within 2 or 3 years by the colony itself. For some reason, it seems to be forgotten that the only reason why we have queens that live such a long period of time is that we prevent swarming and sometimes prevent supersedure as well. Before swarm prevention became a main practice with beekeepers, boys were often hired by beekeepers to stand in their bee yards for one sole purpose, and that was to watch for colonies issuing swarms so that they could either catch the swarm or alert the beekeeper so that the beekeeper could do that himself. Swarming used to be one of the beekeepers' main tools to increase the number of colonies they had, especially for skep beekeepers to refill their beehives that didn't make it through winter or to increase the number of skeps. Now, as we know, honey is a lot more valuable than sugar, and beekeepers have learned that bees will happily eat sugar. In order to maximize honey production, beekeepers started taking all the honey off of a hive and feeding sugar back to the bees for the bees' winter stores, and also sometimes in the spring to help the bees build back up in preparation for the early spring flows. First, we learned we could take honey without killing the nest, but then we started taking all of the bees' honey and feeding back sugar. Thankfully, this has somewhat gone out of fashion, and beekeepers are starting to leave the fall honey for the bees, but people still take more honey than they should earlier on in the season, and they end up feeding sugar to the bees anyway when the fall flow fails, or we end up with a long and harsh winter. Although beekeepers have fed their bees long before the onset of package bees, feeding truly became a necessity during the package boom. Bees supplied in packages come from the subtropics and are accustomed to much longer foraging seasons than bees that come from temperate climates. Package bees were mostly Italian, but Carnolians and hybrid species as well as northern breeds have become available. But the fact remains that these bees have been raised and bred in the subtropics for many generations. Even if a northern survivor is sent to Florida to be bred, chances are her mother or grandmother was also sent to Florida to be bred and was mated with Florida drones. These bees almost unwaveringly need to be fed in the spring to build up when they normally would be out foraging in the Florida climate. However, the problem is today is that people don't even remember a time when bees didn't need to be fed in the spring. Not only do people feed in the spring to help the bees build up, but now we're forced to feed in the spring just so that they'll survive. Even bees from true northern stocks are being fed just so that they'll survive the winter and early spring. So long as bees are continued to be fed to artificially lengthen the season, they will continue to require being fed or die from starvation. And that's during a time when the bees would still be waiting to wake up if the bees were properly adapted to the place where we made their home. Bees in the temperate zone in the wild, and yes, there are still bees out in the wild, do not build up as early or as fast. They do replenish their numbers through winter, but they don't build up for a flow that isn't going to be there because it's still winter. Bees in the temperate wild build homes in cavities that are much smaller than the homes that we expect them to overwinter in, and with a whole lot less food than what we think they need to get through winter. According to Tom Seeley, the ideal size for a colony in the general New York area is about 10 gallons or 40 liters, give or take. That's just about the size of one 10-frame deep Langstroth hive. In nature, this size of cavity gives the bees just enough room to fill up and get honeybound just before winter sets in. They eat some of that honey over the winter, and in the spring when they've built back up, the colony quickly becomes honeybound again and the bees swarm. Just like the old beehives of yore when we couldn't manage the brood nest. And if left to their own, they do this every single year. The use of treatments for diseases and pests is obviously a new condition. The first treatments for bee disease began with the use of terramycin to treat and prevent American foul brood, which itself became a serious epidemic due to the ability to share resources that movable frame hives like the Langstroth hive afforded. There are still some commercial beekeepers today that live by terramycin and would suffer losing nearly their entire operation if they stopped. Treating should obviously have some consequences, as science and medicine has learned that using treatments to eradicate diseases and pests have short-term benefit. However, they have two longer-term consequences. The first one is adding selection pressure to the pathogen, thus breeding pests and diseases that become resistant to the treatment. And two, prevention of adaptation by the host species, or selection of the host species by the disease or pest. This equates to diseases and pests that cannot be effectively managed, and hosts that never had the opportunity to express or to develop the ability to manage the problem on their own. Today, there are commercial beekeepers who live by terramycin, and who would suffer losing their entire operations to foul brood if they stopped, because they are using the treatment to keep AFB at bay that has already become deeply embedded in every hive of their operation. If they stopped using it, all their bees are going to get American foul brood like that. Another new phenomenon is the heating or insulation of beehives in the winter. In nature, the honeybee's natural range extends almost to the Arctic Circle. Apis mellifera mellifera can be found throughout Central Europe and large sweeps of Northern Europe. AMM can be found in the UK, the Orkney Islands, the Shetland Islands, Sweden, Norway, and Poland. These are very cold places. Do we have AMM here in the United States? Well, not so much, but we do have AM linguistica, AM carnica, and AM caussica, as well as the Russian honeybee, which comes from eastern Russia. AM linguistica's natural range, which we consider our most southern bee, encompasses almost all of Italy and just a little bit of beyond. Well, do you know what the coldest recorded temperature in Italy ever was? It was minus 60 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 10 degrees colder than the northernmost point of Maine ever recorded. These are some serious cold snaps, and the Italian bee is the most tropical bee that we have here in North America. Anyway, beekeepers in North America have experimented with insulating their hives for about 200 years. And there are a few beekeepers in there who have been insulating their hives for their entire beekeeping careers. Today, however, it is so commonplace that beekeepers will call you foolish for not taking the advantages that insulating your hives will have. What exactly does insulating or otherwise artificially keeping your bees warm in the winter do for your bees? The bees don't have to deal with the cold with as much difficulty. They stay active for much longer and may wake up from torpor sooner as the temperatures start to rise. Additionally, selection pressure for cold hardiness is reduced. Just like feeding and treatments, one can see that insulating your hives has lots of short-term benefits, but what about the long-term effects? Alright, so can you see a trend here? The paradigm shift that has been slowly marching through time is the bees' ability to care for and manage themselves being taken away, piece by piece, for almost 200 years. In a land where the bees once thrived and multiplied so quickly that the Native American peoples of the inner nations were introduced to bees before they ever saw the Europeans that brought them here. We are losing our bees at an astonishing rate. But why is that? It's a really good question with an answer. Well, two, in fact. First is the philosophy about keeping bees alive. It is perhaps the worst thing that we have ever done for the bees or any other species in our care. And the second is a change in perception. And I'll get to that after I finish the first answer. In the millions of years that the bees have been flying around this globe, no one has ever taken care of them. They took care of themselves. If they weren't fit, they died. Because the unfit died, they no longer contributed their lack of fitness to the gene pool. The survivors, those who expressed the traits that were needed to survive, continued, passed on their traits to the next generation. And this continues over time. It's called natural selection, and it is a well-known and well-understood process that was taught to you when you were in 3rd grade. This is a well-understood and important part of species staying strong, adapting, and evolving over time to the ever-changing pressures of nature. Today, having started slowly almost 200 years ago, we have developed one at a time and continue to stack on top of each other heaps of novelties to give advantages to the bees, assuring their survival from this or from that threat. Today, because of our recently found humane need to take care of the bees, and all living things under our care really, and because we are facing threats to the bees' very existence, we continue this trend of save the bees. I think, unfortunately, what we've done over the last 200 years has finally caught up with us, and the bees are at an actual new baseline. If the bees had been left to natural selection to determine fitness, then the new threats as they came would have just been another drop in the bucket that the bees had to adapt to. But because of the heap of advantages that we keep laying on the bees, the introduction of a new threat threatens to collapse the tower, threatens to collapse the entire heap. I really think beekeepers are just doing what they could to increase their hauls every now and again. But over time, the practices used to give advantages to the bees, advantages that were, at the time, novel, have now become commonplace, and the bees have adapted to them as the new baseline of pressure. We have slowly increased the level of pampering and protection that we have given our bees. So much so that the bar or baseline has risen, and the bees have been bred to rely on it as part of their environment. They've adapted to it. Listen, 200 years doesn't seem like a long time to you and I, but to the bees, it's an eternity of adaptation. In 200 years, there are probably at least 200 generations of bees, probably a lot more than that, due to some accelerated breeding programs that produced a few AI queen mothers that are the mothers and grandmothers of nearly all the bees that we have in North America. During the last 200 years, natural selection has not been a huge deciding factor in the fitness of the species. 200 generations is a staggering number. To put it into perspective and to put it into human scales, calling 20 years a human generation. How much have humans changed over the last 4,000 years? It was only 10,000 years ago that Neanderthals were still roaming northern Europe. I don't think anyone today can argue that the bees are not domesticated. Today's bees are almost entirely the result of manual selection that has set the fitness of the bees back dramatically. For 200 years, we have bred a bee that must be cared for or it's gonna die. Well, thankfully, that's not 100% true. And there is a way back. And that's where we get to the second answer to the question, why are the bees dying? The second answer is a change of perception and some forgotten history. Today, over good winters, we lose maybe 15 to 20% of our bees. Maybe less. And on bad years, we lose 30 to 40%. And we consider that a catastrophe. It was only 30 years ago that a beekeeper could expect for his hive to last years and years and years without any interference, so long as it made it through its first winter. And even if it didn't, a new package installed into that mostly finished hive will probably make it, and it'll last for years and years. Well, it was only just about 100 years ago that C.C. Miller wrote his third book, 50 Years Among the Bees. In it, he described all the different methods that he experimented with, his successes, and also honest with his failures. Do you know what kind of losses he experienced during his 50 years among the bees? Well, in places where he made his numbers clear, in 1870, he lost 15% of his hives. 1871, he lost 94%. 1872, 84%. 1873, he lost no bees, 0% loss. 1874, 22%. 1875, 15% loss. 1876 through 1880, 2% losses per year. 1881, 62% loss, 62%. However, despite those winter losses, he still managed to double or triple the number of his beehives every year. In 9 years, he went from 3 beehives to 177 hives, attributing half of his increase to swarm capture and the other half to performing increase by splits. Additionally, and over time, his losses started to stabilize once he had worked through losing so many of his bees. Once in a while, and throughout the rest of the 50 years of his beekeeping, some beekeeping disaster or another would hit. He'd lose a bunch of beehives and then rebuild in the spring while still managing to pull a decent honey crop. So losing bees might hurt your feelings, and it might hurt your wallet if you continue to buy bees. But in the end, letting your bees die and rebuilding from the survivors is still the best means of getting your bees adapted to your local area, your climate, and your conditions. And yes, that includes letting the bees deal with varroa, and if they die, plan for losses, plan to rebuild, and keep nukes to drop into your winter deadouts. And you'll grow because the unfit bees did you the favor of dying and making room for your fit bees. The problem in recent decades is the slow accumulation of pampering of our bees kept our bees alive long enough that no one today really remembers that keeping bees alive so easily was never normal. Keeping bees alive is the aberration, because the unfit ones did you the favor of dying and letting you breed new fit bees from your survivors. In future videos, we are going to be discussing means of maintaining our production populations despite fall and winter losses. And we'll be working together and journaling the successes and the failures of our operation as we grow from 0 hives back to profitability, all while breeding bees adapted to my and to your location. Now listen, if you found this video to be of any value whatsoever, I want you to please subscribe and ring the little bell icon so that you can be notified the next time we upload our video. And please leave a comment below. I honestly and am truly interested in any comments or questions that you might have.